Hi, I'm Ryan from Ryan Going Rogue, and this is one of my podcasts covering football, craft beer, and brewing, as well as the tech needed for creators to do what they do. If you like what you see, consider subscribing and hitting that bell notification. Thanks for listening, and enjoy the podcast. Welcome back to RGR Craft. I'm Ryan, and this is me going rogue on craft beer, the beer industry, and a little bit of home brewing. Thanks for joining me again. And like I've told you in the past, from time to time, there's going to be an audio podcast on here. And this is one of those times. So let me get started. And tonight, I'm drinking a pale ale from a company out in Oregon that is growing really quickly to be one of my favorites. It is Ecliptic out of Oregon. Somebody that I think I'll probably review this beer coming up, as well as a number of others. They have a great palate. And I think they're going to be in the show tonight as I run down. And this is what I'm going to do from time to time. Talk a little bit of homebrewing and a little bit of what I found out there to give you guys some ideas about what you might want to try. I have a tendency to roam around the country whenever I travel for work or anything else football related. And I try a lot of local beers, and I try a lot of beers from a lot of different regions. And I keep those tracked on an app called Untappd. That's Untappd. And if you want to jump on there, I know several of you already do follow me on there, but my handle's Ryan Tracy 142. You can always friend me on there, and you can see some of this. Next time I do this, I'll try to capture the screen or my phone or something so you can see some of the visuals, because a large part of exploring beer is how it looks when you first open it, get it poured, and have a look at what it is you're going to be ingesting. And so that's something that I want to do in the future. But tonight, as I get ready to record this, I'm heading out of town. It's the third preseason game of the football season, and things have just been real hectic, so I just thought I'd do some audio for you. And what I'm going to do is go through my Untappd profile, going back a couple of months. I'll probably just pick a month. Let's do June, say, and I'll go through some of the highlights of the beers that I drank that particular month. So look for this review of Ecliptic's Pale Ale coming up. That won't be today, though. So let's go through this. So as I go back, and I'm just scrolling through my particular profile, just the beers that I've drank and recorded and how I rated them. And some really stand out. There's sours, there's stouts, there's a wild ale. The one that I want to start with is, I think because it has not only a great name, but it's one of my favorite styles, and it's a Farmhouse Ale. Brewery West is the way it comes out, but it's swelled with a J and all kinds of stuff. Anyway, you can see it on the profile. And the beer is a Saison, a Farmhouse Ale, and that is in the tradition of when Belgian, quote-unquote, peasants used to brew for themselves, come in from the fields where they worked and make beer for themselves in a farmhouse, and that's the whole point of this. Very rustic tasting, a little bit of funk, and what is a lighter beer that still has a lot of flavor. It is really, really tasty, and quite honestly, varies quite a bit. It's a Belgian tradition, and it's something that I check out everywhere I go. This one in particular was done by a brewery, Brewery West in Washington State, and threw it on top of some blackberries, so you get a little bit of fruit flavor with it, too. And this is a really unique way to do it, and something you don't see all the time. And it's a 5 rating system. I gave it a 3.5, and it's something that I would come back to. My wife's a big fan of Saison, so we end up drinking those quite a bit. And if you are in the mood for one, I'm sure you can find it around the Pacific Northwest. For those of you listening in California, I'm sure that's available at a couple of places. And I'll have some ideas at some tap rooms or some bottle shops that you might be able to find out in other areas other than Kansas City as well. I know I've been talking a lot to the Kansas City folks because there's so many listening to this channel because of the football. So I hope you guys give it a shot. You could try a number of places around KC. I know Lucas carries a bunch of these. You can always try Gomer's on the Missouri side. Give those a shot. I think you'll find this pretty enticing. Moving on. Let's see here. The next one that kind of got me going in the right direction was a Goes, which is a sour beer. And this one in particular is called Green Zebra from Founders. And a lot of you may be familiar, if you know craft beer, with Founders because it's so unique. They make a lot of good beer, a lot of interesting beer, to tell you the truth. And they're worth trying anytime you get a chance. I know they get distributed down in Kansas City some, but throughout the Midwest. They're out of Grand Rapids, Michigan. And another beer that does some service is a little bit of a departure for them. You get some of their bigger beers, heavier beers that are more notable. But Green Zebra is a nice, refreshing goes that actually breaks apart those heavier meals. I personally feel that both these styles, the Saisons and Goses, any kind of light soured beer goes really well with barbecue because it breaks up the sweetness and the char of the bark. And I think it's really great. It's something that I always pair when I'm drinking that kind of thing, when I'm eating a big barbecue meal. And honestly, every time I go home, that's what I do. Moving on, probably one of the highlights at 4.25 for me is a really, really interesting beer from Almanac. Again, classified as a Saison, but is a little bit above and beyond. Now, this is out of Alameda, California, Almanac Beer Company, and they do a lot of really interesting things with not only brewing soured beers, brewing Saisons, brewing the lighter fare, but they do fruited beers and they do a lot of aged beers. And what you get when you age a Saison, especially in a foeder, which is a former wine barrel, you end up getting a lot of little floral hints, some grape overnotes, and I find it, again, really refreshing to go with a heavier meal. So I like this one in particular. It's probably my favorite that I've had from them. And, you know, it's kind of an uplifting name. It's a really pale color, and I'll try to get some pictures of it again when we do the video review. But it's called Sunshine and Opportunity. Great name from a really interesting beer manufacturer that I think if you get a chance to try it, I think you should do that. If you're in California, I know they're all over the place. They're up in Oregon as well. And I believe they're out in Kansas City, at least in a couple of places. So I think it's definitely worth your time to try those out, take a look, and see if you can get into that. We've been talking a lot on this channel so far about lighter beers, trying to compare what it's like to when you drink just domestic Pilsners, and then when you try to move over and explore some of the other light beers from around the world, because the styles are really different, even though they may look fairly similar. So this is another one that I think you should try. Moving on, like I said, Ecliptic is a company that I drink a lot of. They are quickly becoming one of my top 10 breweries from around the country. And they are out of Oregon, like I said, do a great job and are really, really varied. They just celebrated their 5th year anniversary. They're in Portland. They do have a brew pub too, so if you happen to be there, give that a shot. This one in particular that I'm drinking tonight is called Quasar, and interesting, every beer that they make is named after a phenomenon in space. Quasar, the beer that I had in June, the one that I'm going to tell you about right now, is one that is a different style, but it's called Phobos, one of the moons of Jupiter, I believe, if I can remember correctly. But it's a traditional Irish ale, an Irish red, that they over-hopped with a tropical hop called Azaka, and I believe that's from New Zealand. And it gives it a really interesting twist and brightens up the overall flavor. That's something that you don't get all the time in a red ale. Red ales really are normally, if you think back to, like Smithwick's Red, or for those of you that go back to Killian's, when Killian's was still independent, they tasted of a malt, of a real caramel kind of flavor. That still exists, and that's still, to a traditional red ale, that's how it should taste. That is to the guidelines, and we can talk about guidelines later in the next couple of episodes as we get into home brewing, which I'm going to be doing here in the next couple of weeks. I'm going to be doing my next batch. I'm not sure if I'm going to do a triple or going to do an IPA, but I will document that. I have some video that I will show you in coming weeks about some of the basics of how you go about home brewing, because I figure a lot of folks who might be into craft beer or just finding it through this channel may be interested in learning about home brewing too. It's a really interesting way. If you like to cook, you'll love to make beer. It is legal. It is something that you can access anywhere across the country, and it lets you basically be a cook and bring out all the flavors that you like in a beer. And it's great for experimentation, really interesting, and can be artistic. But this Phobos Red gets me back to not only having the base of that multi-character of a good Irish red, but then taking it into a modern feel that has a little bit more high-end tropical fruit, a little bit brighter finish. so you don't feel the sugar, the sweetness of it as much. They did a good job drying this one out in terms of fermentation as well, and that takes it to a new level. Great job from Ecliptic. If you get a chance, they are distributed across the country in certain pockets. If you get a chance to go to a beer fest and they're pouring, please look them up. Their PR folks are great. I've run into them at multiple festivals, and they're always fun to talk to. And they're always looking for ideas. And that's really the greatest thing about them. I think they are one of the up-and-coming breweries in America, and I think you're going to hear a lot more about them as they go forward. Let's see. Moving on. And this brings me to probably the highest-rated beer I had for the month of June. It's from Firestone Walker out in California. And for those of you listening in California, you know this too well for me to explain any farther than what you've already experienced. But if you are new to craft beer in general, Firestone Walker is a brewery in California that goes to extreme lengths to not only brew great beer, but to emulate classic English styles of old. They are very forward in their IPA line, and there's too many to name, to tell you the truth. But the one that always keeps me coming back is a beer that they call Dark and Stormy, and it's because it is my favorite style of English beer, and that is an English barley wine. And for those of you that just had to do a double take and said, what in the world is a barley wine? You can think of Guinness. Most people know what Guinness looks like. Most have had it once or twice. That's a stout. That is a dark beer that is opaque and not meant to be seen through, and has a lot of robust flavors and is really lingering on the classic style of an Irish dry stout. Well, the English version of the heaviest beer is one called a barley wine, and it is achieved by mashing a larger amount of grain, sometimes with more productive yeast, a yeast that can go down to a lower terminal value in their gravity, and try to dry out the beer. Some end up sweet. This one in particular is a little on the sweeter side. I prefer generally a drier barley wine, because at the end of the day, what ends up happening, and they call it barley wine because it is produced like every other beer from barley, but it ends up generally with an alcohol above 10%, double your Budweisers, your normal everyday drinking Pilsners, light lagers, pale ales. And it ends up in the range there of a wine. Sometimes, I don't know the exact number for the BJCP and what their guidelines are, but most barley wines that I have come across are somewhere between 10.5 to 14% alcohol, which can be a little bit dangerous, especially if you're not drinking at home. But this one in particular is a really interesting combination of beer that isn't as dark as a Guinness. And that's why I brought that up. So visually, when we get back to this, it'll make more sense. But it is not that heavy. You can see through it. It's heavily tinted, but it's not opaque. And it has a smoother, more caramel base. It has a couple of hints from the way that it's made and some of the malts that are used. You get a little bit of a rum flavor out of it. It is thicker than your average beer, but not as thick as, say, an Imperial Stout, but is a beer that comes across with hints underneath the caramel flavor, the rum flavor of some lighter things like lime, like tropical fruit, a little bit underneath there. It depends on the version. The formula changes a little bit every year. This is the 2018 that I happen to have this year. So I'm a little bit behind. There are people that cellar these, and these are keeper beers. They can cellar them for years and years and years. I prefer about a 2-year timeline on any cellared beer. I think a lot of them have a tendency to over-oxidize and go bad past that. But in fact, I have a wheat one that I'll probably tell you guys about the next time I go through this, because it was a great story of how we acquired that beer, how we cellared it for several years, 3 to be exact, and how it all worked out. So I'll tell you that next time. But I want to leave you this week with an idea that there's a vast variety of craft beers out there and all kinds of things. You can find information on them everywhere. Craftbeer.com. Craft Beer and Brewing is a great magazine and website that can tell you about this. Good Beer Hunting, which has featured a number of breweries, not only around the areas that we're talking about today in Portland and California, but in Kansas City as well. There's a brewery down there that I've been to a couple of times that I want to give a shout out to Brian out at BKS. off of 63rd in Kansas City. It's worth going out there. Some of you have already been, I'm sure. But give that a look. If you do, tell them I sent you. And I hope that you guys take this particular podcast, even though it's just audio, and kind of run with it. I hope that you explore some of these titles. I'll put them all in the show notes and try to get that organized for you. And in the coming weeks, I'll be back to video. I'll do some walkthrough, and we'll start talking about some homebrew. So, that said, thank you for listening today. Enjoy your beers. Enjoy your weekend, and I'll talk to you next time.